And so let's do this. We are going to be introducing a new series this morning as we venture deeper into the new year. And as we do, I just want to, hit that first slide, that one with not the slide for the series, but the one right before it. No, keep going, one down. I don't want to give away the name of the slide because I'm going to do a little trivia question here. That's the one for the series. Very good. That's what we're going to be doing. There should be one more right before that. There it is. That's the one I was looking for. How many people recognize this television show? Boy, Matt, you killed it. Antiques Roadshow. Antiques Roadshow. Very, very good. People remember that show? That was pretty good. And so this was a great show where people would take stuff in their houses. They would take antiques that they had lying around, and they would bring it to the experts that were art dealers and experts in antiques, and they would give them an approximation of how much their item was worth. And there was two specific items that always make for the best shows. One of them was when somebody would come and think they had this amazing thing. I have this signed letter from Abraham Lincoln to so-and-so, and they would come, they were all expectant, and they'd be like, this is a forgery, I'm really sorry, right? And so they would be, it was sad, but it would make for interesting television. But the other one, which was better because it was happy, was when somebody would bring a picture in and be like, I don't know, this has been hanging in my grandparents' house for, as long as I can remember. I don't know who painted it, I don't know what it is, and the guy would be like, oh my goodness, that's like an original Monet or something, and it's worth like $2 million, and the people can't believe that this thing that they didn't realize was so important and so valuable had been hanging in their house for so long. That would make the two best shows. But there's something that you and I all carry that is like that expensive painting that we didn't know we had. There's something that is super valuable. Matter of fact, the most valuable thing in this world that we all carry, and sometimes we don't recognize just how valuable it is. And that is, it's number one, it's Jesus, but it is the good news. It's the gospel, the good news of Jesus. This message of restoration of relationship with the Father through Jesus. This good news that Jesus has died for us to forgive our sins and open up access to God, to heal us and bring wholeness and restoration. The good news of the gospel that God has acted and moved in a decisive way in this world. This is truly and it really good news. And if you remember last year, we did a series that was just entitled Good News. So if you forget how good this news is, just take a look at that series. And so this is good news that we carry. And it's good news, as we'll talk about in just a moment, that the world needs to hear. Specifically, what we're going to look at this series, and if you hit the one for the series slide that says, should say Bridging the Gap, you have that one. This is the series we're doing. I want to specifically talk about taking this good news, this amazing news that brings hope and healing, that Jesus changes everything. And how do we bring that news to bear to a younger generation, particularly the Gen X's and the Gen Z's of this world, our younger folks who are increasingly non-Christian, who increasingly won't show up in a church, who increasingly don't have a grid for things of faith? How do we take this amazing news that can bring hope and healing to a generation that is really hurting? How do we do that in a way that we'll see people come to faith? This kind of really does roll out of my heart and my desire, and I believe God's calling to us as a church to see growth here in this church through people coming into a relationship with Jesus for the first time. If you remember last week, and we talked about that, I really feel like we've had a great year this last year. We have grown numerically, but I really feel like what God wants to highlight this year is growth numerically through new people coming to faith, as represented and evidenced by baptisms. And so how do we do that? How do we do what we are called to do in deeper ways, in better ways? How do we specifically reach out to those who are the younger ones among us? It's not always easy. It's going to take a little bit of stretching, but this series is designed to hit both our head and our hearts, right? The desire to reach out, but also the how. How do we do it? How do we communicate with a generation that seems so different than us? And so it'll be kind of both, a head and a heart thing. We really do want to equip you to better have conversations with those who are younger. And so that's what we're looking at during this series. How do we do that? How do we reach out to those who are younger, particularly in this culture that is, again, increasingly post-Christian? Specifically, what we're looking at is millennials and Gen Zers. And so this series, as I just said, is going to give us both the head and the heart to communicate and to live out the good news of Jesus here we are. Here we go. And so this is going to be both practical, and I really hope it hits our heart, is that these younger generations are ones who are increasingly depressed and anxious and sexually broken and confused. It should break our heart. It should move us to want to see them changed and rescued. And so that's really what we're doing. And so let's look first, the heart, because this is true. I believe this is such a true statement. I'm going to say it a couple of times today. It'll probably come up again and again in this series, is that to the extent to which our hearts are broken about something is the extent to which we will do something about it. Let me read that again. The extent to which our hearts are broken about something is the extent to which we will do something about it. If we don't have a grid for something, if we don't really care about something, we just leave it aside. How do we increasingly capture God's heart for a younger generation so that we care? Because when we care, when we hurt, when we recognize that we carry good news, and this good news is so desperately needed by this generation, it's going to move us, I believe, towards doing something about it. This is, as I said, good news. The gospel is good news. Last week we talked through Hebrews a little bit, right? Hebrews is such an amazing book, and so I just want to read a couple of verses from Hebrews that reminds us just how good this gospel is, just how good this good news is, just how good what Jesus came to do is. And so, if you think about it, that the real issue in humanity, is it's separation from God. All the brokenness that we see in our own lives, all the brokenness we see in this world, the sin that so easily entangles, really is at heart, the cause of it is separation from God. And look what Jesus has come to do. If we go to Hebrews chapter 10, verse 19, it says, "Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened up for us through the curtain, that is his flesh." Let me pause it right there. Remember, as we talked about Hebrews, we said this is the context of this book was that he was writing to Jewish Christians. So it's a book, when you read it sometimes in Hebrews, it can seem a little confusing because it's very Jewish. And so the context of it, the language he's talking about is very Jewish. But what is he talking about? In the Old Testament, if you remember the temple, right? So where they would go to, where the priests would offer sacrifices. You remember there was when you would come into the temple, there was the one spot where it was the holy place, where they would offer the sacrifices, and then behind the holy place, behind a veil, was the Holy of Holies, that place where actually God's presence dwelt, where the Ark of the Covenant was, and it was separated by this thick curtain. And only one time a year would the high priest go in there. So God's presence, people were separated from God's presence. The only one who could go into God's presence was the high priest, and that once a year, and that with sacrifices and things like that. What he's telling these Jewish believers now is that there is a new way into God's presence. God is no longer hiding behind a veil. Jesus has torn that veil, and the sacrifices aren't the sacrifices of animals offered year after year, month after month. The sacrifice was a once and for all sacrifice of Jesus, the perfect and spotless Lamb. And now, because of what Jesus has done, now there's nothing that comes between you and God. No longer does there have to be a priest who offers sacrifices. You can now come boldly into God's presence. This is good news for us. And so he says, by the new and living way that he opened up, which is his flesh, right? Jesus allowed when Jesus died on the cross, right? It says that the veil that was torn in two. And he said, since we have a great high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. The sacrifice of Christ was not like the Old Testament sacrifices that washed us outwardly, made us outwardly clean. The sacrifice of Christ heals us on the inside, that changes our nature, that everything that was lost at the fall in the garden has been healed, that we now have the ability to overcome sin. We have the ability to come into God's presence. We have healing and hope in Jesus. It's good news. The gospel is good news that all of your places of brokenness and hurt can be addressed because of what Christ has done. The gospel is good news, and it's good news not just for us. We have to keep this in mind, that the gospel is good news for everyone. You know John 3:16, right? God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son. But John 3:17 also, what does it say? It says, for he did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, to point fingers at the world, but actually came in order that the world might be saved through him. This good news is a message for the whole world that there is a way to salvation, there's a way to rescue, there's a way to healing, there's a way to the Father, and it's through Jesus. My desire is that we would capture God's heart for God's people. That we would capture the heart for how good this message is and how deeply a hurting world needs it. My prayer is that we would capture a heart like Nehemiah's. I want to read a little bit from the book of Nehemiah, another Old Testament book. Nehemiah was written at a time where God's people were still in captivity. And so other world powers swoop in, and because of Israel's sin, right, they are punished. They are taken out of Jerusalem. They are overthrown, and they are taken into captivity. And it's while they're in captivity that Nehemiah, who happens to be the cupbearer to the king, he finds out a little bit about how things are going back in Jerusalem. And so in Nehemiah chapter 1, it just says, now it happened in the month of Chislev, in the 12th year, as I was in Susa, the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. So apparently there were some who didn't get taken into captivity. There's a small remnant of God's people still living in God's city, Jerusalem. They're still there. He's asking, how's it going with God's house? How's it going with God's people who are still there? And it says, and they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. He gets this really rough message that things in God's house are not very good. The ones who are there are few of them. They're under duress. The temple and the walls and the city are broken down. Things are not good. Things are not the way that God would want them. There is trouble there. And it says, verse 4, as soon as I heard these words, I sat down and I wept and I mourned for days. And I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And it kind of highlights his prayers. And then it says, in the next chapter, he actually goes before the king and asks, hey, can we go back and rebuild? But I love Nehemiah's heart when he hears about the way things are, the way that, the way things are in Jerusalem, the way things are with God's temple and God's house and God's people when they're not going well, when people are broken and hurting and confused and vulnerable. His heart was one that broke for them. His heart was one that came before God with weeping and mourning and fasting because his heart was broken for what breaks God's heart. Oh, that we would have a heart like Nehemiah, who then confesses his sins and for the sins of the people, who and then does something about it. He actually goes before the king and says, hey, can we go back and do something about this? Oh, that we would have Nehemiah's heart for a younger generation. A younger generation, as I said a bunch of times, is really hurting and so desperately need it. And so if we can get the heart and God's heart for the situation and the reality of how good this gospel is, I believe it's going to start moving us to do something about it. And so if I were to give you a challenge at the end of this, which I will, is to say, can you pray? Can you be praying? Spend time in prayer to allow God to remember last week we talked about leading into discomfort? This is a little discomfort, right? Can you ask God to make you a little uncomfortable when you see those of a younger generation that are hurting, that look different from you, that dress different from you, that have different perspectives, that are living lifestyles that maybe you think is not right? Can you allow God to see them with his eyes? Can we begin to be moved with compassion and a desire to bring good news to them? That's my desire for this series. But how do we do it? As I said, how do we do it with folks that are a lot different and a lot younger than some of us? I'm not super old, but I'm starting to recognize more and more that the world that I grew up in is not the world of today. There's different perspectives, there's different thoughts, there's different ways that things go. And so the older I get, the more I realize that. So if we're going to reach a younger generation, it's imperative that we first understand better who they are and what their viewpoints are. We have to know them. if we're going to connect with them and talk to them and help them and point them towards the good news that's in Jesus. And so, as I said, we live in an increasingly post-Christian world. We live in a world, when I was younger, and again, depending on, I'm 52, by the way, just so everybody knows where I'm coming from. I feel like I'm young, but maybe I'm not as young as I once was. There was a time not that long ago when people had a high view of church. People had a Christian worldview and perspective, even if they weren't necessarily churchgoers. Right? Even if they weren't, maybe they were like myself, right? Christmas and Easter, Catholic kind of thing. Even if you were just marginally a church-type person, a person of faith, we probably have a lot in common. They would still have a high view of the Bible. They would have a high view of church. They would, morality, for the most part, we would agree with right and wrong and how we live, I think. That's changed very rapidly. Again, as I said, we live in a post-Christian, an increasingly post-Christian world. Matter of fact, one of the statistics that you see very often when they study things like religious affiliations and things like that is that the largest growing group in these studies is the nuns, the religiously unaffiliated. So more and more when people fill out surveys about, what religion, do you go to church, kind of religious kind of things, the group that's growing the fastest are those that would say, I do not have any religion. Right? I don't really have faith. I don't practice my faith. The religiously unaffiliated, they're called. And so just statistically, the category, this entire category, this religious nuns, in a 2021 study said it was 29% of the population. Let's see. I'm sorry. That was 2021, was 29%. That was up 19% from 2011. So the course of just 10 years, those religiously unaffiliated became 10% more of our population. It was actually even more pronounced in millennials, which would be those who were like 29 to 44-year-olds. In 2016, that religious nun, 38% of millennials in 2016. And in 2022, just 2 years ago, or 3 years ago now, 44%. 44% of folks that were 29 to 44-year-old would say, I'm not religious. I don't go to church. Gen Z, even more. Gen Zers, and this is really where my heart is for this series, Gen Zs, 13-year-olds to 28-year-olds. So like teenagers through like late 20s. In 2016, the religious nuns in that group, 39%. Now in 2022, 48.5%. So almost 50% of folks, 13 to 28-year-olds, would say, I'm a religious nun. I don't have a faith. I don't have a religion. I don't go to church. It's really not part of my life. Increasingly post-Christian. So how do we respond as a church to this trend? Do we just write these guys off? Do we just say, oh, well, they're living different lives and we'll just leave them be? Or do we do the stretching work? Do we lean into the discomfort of getting to know these people? This younger generation, getting to know what makes them tick, getting to know their perspectives and viewpoints, not being, I think as a church we so often keep those who look different from us and dress different from us and live different lifestyles from us, we kind of leave them way out to the sides. When they come in, I'm not saying our church, I think the church in general, makes them feel like they're outsiders, that they're unwelcomed. How do we do the hard work of actually building bridges, closing the gap? Showing them love and kindness. We do it, I believe, by getting to know who they are better and reaching out. We could simply grow on the back of transfer growth. We can simply grow as a church by people who left other churches or people who went to church a while ago and want to come back now. But I believe that God is calling us to do the work of leading into the discomfort and reaching out to a younger generation. That's what I believe God has for us. And if this is the case, if we're going to reach to a people who are different from us and a culture who are different from us, and even if you're in that culture, right? If you are 13 to 28, if you're at church, it probably means that you have a little bit of a different perspective than your friends around you, right? I'm sure that, Wes, you probably see that. And so we need to consider ourselves to be missionaries to our own people in our own cities. We cannot expect that people will simply show up to church or even have a grid for church. We can't expect the same come and see invitations and models of evangelism to work. It used to be you just invite people to a church event. Come on to my church. I think increasingly that's not working and that's not effective, that people don't have a high view. We're going to talk about it in a minute. They don't have a high view of church. They don't have a grid for church. Why would I come to church? What's the point? And so I think this simple, hey, come on to my church is I think, increasingly ineffective. we need to think of ourselves as missionaries. This is a quote from a book, and much of the head part that we're discussing, getting to know the younger generation, is based on a book that's called Not Beyond Reach. It's a great book called Not Beyond Reach by Aaron Pearson. And in the book he said, the truth is, though, that as resistant as many post-Christians and non-Christians seem, and as far from God as their words and behavior might suggest, people are hungry and hurting. There is a need there. They are open even when they don't appear to be. As followers of Jesus, we clearly need to respond, and we can't wait for people to come to us. We must go to them. We must go to them. We must engage people in ways that they're going to understand. To do that, we need to understand them. We need to adopt, as I said, a missionary mindset. If you think about a missionary, if you were going to be a traditional cross-cultural missionary, what would you do? One of the things you would do before you left, you would learn the language. You would learn their culture. You would learn some of their history. Because if you could have a wonderful message for them, but if they don't speak the same language, they're not going to understand you. And so this is how missionaries think. How do I take this ancient message of the good news of the gospel, this unchanging message, this timeless message, and how do I present it in a way that is going to hit home to people now? How are they going to hear it? How do I present it in a way that they hear it? We do that by learning their language, their culture, and things like that. And so we have to think in these terms if we're going to reach a younger generation. We don't have to leave. As a matter of fact, that's what's amazing. We don't have to go to another country. We simply have to go to work or school or the shopping center or the gym or the bowling alley. We're filled with people in this younger generation who think differently. We think of ourselves as missionaries? How do we learn their language? That's what we're going to try to do a little bit. And so I'm going to go through this fairly quick. My notes in the Vineyard Hopewell app have all these little, I'm going to hit 3 of these and 3 of those. And so they're all in the notes if you want to go back and look at them. But I just want to paint a picture of who this younger generation is, particularly these Gen Zs. I want to hit... To effectively communicate the gospel to a post-Christian culture, it's important to understand 3 key realities about this younger generation. Number 1, that secular people have become suspicious of religious institutions and are far less likely to attend a church event. Statistics would show that in 2001, 60% of the population had a high confidence in religious institutions. Now it's down to 31%. And so just secular folks and younger folks' view of just the church in general is going down and down and down. Their perspective of the relevance of church and the importance of church, it's gone down. It's not just the church, actually. If you notice the young generation, it's politics and government, it's big business. I think they're wary of any kind of big group. But their confidence in the church has gone down. Number 1, that's one of the realities for them. They also, as I've been saying, they don't hold the same assumptions about morality, truth, the authority of the Bible, the existence and the nature of God that earlier generations did. As I said, there was a time where even if you didn't go to church, your perspectives on like where we came from and what morality is and what our purpose is and where we go after we die, these are all things that I think most people would agree upon. Now it's not their perspectives. It's not their presuppositions. If you were to go to a college campus and ask this traditional evangelistic question, if you were to die today and God were to judge your life, would he let you into heaven? If you were to ask that question to a college-age student now, you might be met with a complete blank stare because that question has so many presuppositions in it that they might not even be following. Is there a God, right? What do you mean, would God let me into heaven? Is there an afterlife, right? Sin, like why would I need forgiveness of sins? Like it's, see what I'm saying? We assume these are obvious questions. Hey, you've sinned, and why would God let... This is just not on their radar. And so we have to recognize that they increasingly don't have the same assumptions about morality and truth. And often, though, here's a good part, is that secular people are often open to spirituality. So this younger generation is often open to spirituality. You hear this a lot. I don't go to church, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual, right? And so there is a hunger, I believe, that is a God-given hunger to connect to something more, a recognition that what they see, what their experience is not all that there is. So there is an openness. I was listening to a podcast yesterday where they were talking about all these amazing revivals that have been going on in college campuses throughout this country last year. It's really, God is doing something really, really good. But God, there's people, there's young folks who feel this way, different assumptions, but they're hungry, and God is moving with them, which is so exciting, I believe, and such an opportunity for us. And so, let's see, because I'm running short on time and I want to hit these. So let's go. So this younger culture, which the author says is a global youth culture, so those are some of their suppositions, right? Religious, suspicious of religious institutions, not the same assumptions, yet open spiritually. But there's also some significant spheres of influence that are influencing this younger generation. He calls it the global youth culture because he says now is more than ever, because of the internet, the young people are influenced by the exact same thing. So whether you're a young person in the Hudson Valley of New York, or you're a young person in China, or you're a young person in England, you're a young person in Africa, because of the internet, they're being influenced by the same things, the same voices, the same places. So this youth culture really is very strong. And so there's a few different influences for them. Number one, the entertainment industry, movies, television, YouTubers and TikTokers who have direct access to people with unfiltered information, video games, pornography. These are things that are absolutely prevalent, which are causing all kinds of problems. They're influenced by the philosophical pillars of their generation. I'm going to just throw three more things at you. I know it's almost like a class today, and I'm so sorry. But again, this is important that even if you grab a little bit of something, that you remember these things. So there's like three philosophical pillars of this young generation. One is secularism. I've thrown that word out there. You're probably familiar with it, but it's kind of like the compartmentalization of faith from social life. Right? For them, faith should be a private matter. Believe what you want, just don't push your beliefs on me. You see that from younger folks, right? That's great that you believe that, but that shouldn't be part of your life, shouldn't be part of the way government runs. It shouldn't be the part of, it's fine for you in your bedroom. It's fine for you maybe for an hour on Sunday. It's fine for your family, but it's not for me. Secularism, the divide between social life and faith, which leads to, and you see this all over the place now, is relativism. The idea that there is no absolute truth, or particularly a universal morality. And so younger generations would believe and feel pretty strongly that we all have our own realities, that we all have our own truths, that we all have our own morality. These things, like particularly morality, have become like your favorite flavor of ice cream. You have your opinions, and it's the same thing for them. It is very relativistic. That's great that that's true for you, but it's not true for my truth. You hear that a lot. My truth is this, or my truth is that. And so for them, truth, things like morality, are relative. And acceptance. Acceptance is huge for this younger generation. Open-mindedness and authenticity are valued highly. Each person should be accepting of everyone else's beliefs and choices, which in the best case would create a culture of inclusion. And so they very much are this way, this open-minded. We all should believe our own way. We all have our own truths, and everybody should be welcomed. The only caveat to that is the only ones that are welcomed would be the only ones that are unwelcomed are the ones that would be exclusive. So if you make an exclusive claim like murder is, well, maybe that, I think everybody still would agree with that. But, when you try to say, like, this is the way you should live, or this is what sexuality should look like, or this is what marriage is, or this is who God is, or this is the way to relationship with God through Jesus. When you make an absolute claim, those are the claims that are not accepted by a tolerant society, right? Does that make sense to you? You see that again and again? It's okay to have your own opinion as long as your opinion isn't in any way exclusive, which makes their inclusivity exclusive, which means that it's all okay except for that. So they're actually, that kind of perspective is actually leading to doing the exact same thing. So they want to be open, but actually they are not, because they do not exceed. Anyway, I'm tongue-tying myself. So this value used to be expressed as tolerance, but it's no longer enough to just tolerate opinions of others. And the ways they live, we must affirm them. I think culture has gone that way. So it's not enough just to say, listen, we think differently, and I don't agree with you, but we can have a relationship and we can be friends, and I can love you and care for you, but not affirm you. Now affirmation is everything. I have to agree with their other perspectives. You have to affirm them. It's the constant message of global youth culture. I do have some questions in there on the app. You can kind of just stick some questions to think through and to think about. So the pillars of it, the influences of this younger generation are important to understand. We also have to understand, just as we kind of close out here, is that we're not dealing primarily with a logical issue. who are not primarily, looking at this simply that they have a different culture. I think at the heart of it is a spiritual blindness issue. I really believe it. It's 2 Corinthians. He says, like, even if our gospel is veiled, it's veiled to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel and the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. And I really feel like at the heart of so much that goes on with this younger generation is a spiritual blindness from the God of this world, who is Satan, right, who would blind their eyes from truth and reality and the truth that is in Jesus. And so we have to kind of recognize that and pray for that. The book does say that he calls the God of this age, well, I think theologically we would say it's Satan, but he says it's secular humanism, right, this view, and this is from the book. He says, God has been replaced, man is at the center, and there is no outside authority that can tell us how to live our lives. There is no outside authority to tell us how to live, meaning and purpose, and are therefore turned inward, so the key to happiness is found from within. Just follow your dreams and don't let anyone tell you who you are or what you want. Resist all external claims to authority or absolutes. And above all, he says, take care of yourself. This is the view of secular humanism. This is the view of our younger generations. Seek it inside. Pursue who you are, right? These things, identity, purpose, morality, are all personal constructs. We are in the my truth era. Like Nehemiah, we need to pray like never before, I believe. Like Nehemiah, we need to get a heart. We need to get God's heart for a younger generation that is increasingly hurting. Because when everything is about you, it becomes a very lonely place. When everything is about you, when the you-know-what hits the fan, when life gets hard and all you've got is yourself and your own thoughts and your own perspectives, when all you have is the good vibes that you can muster up or the good vibes that other people can send your way, you can understand where the anxiety and the depression and the suicides and the sexual brokenness and the hurting, that you can almost see where it comes from a younger generation. The reality is that the church carries the antidote to all of this. But the young people aren't coming to the church to get the answer. It is imperative that we go to them. We have to believe and have to know that we do have the answer to what ails. We have the hope. We have the answer. Can we allow God to move in our hearts in such a way that we are broken, that we recognize, number one, the goodness of the gospel and the need of it for a younger generation, and then to do the sometimes hard work of reaching out to those who are younger. As we go through this series, we're going to look at how do we connect? How do we actually make contact and connect with those who are younger? We want to talk about how do we strike up spiritual conversations with the younger generation? How do we actually talk to them? We want to talk about how do we navigate through some of the tough questions that they have, things like sexuality and politics and science. How do we, as folks of faith, kind of connect the dots for them in these tough areas? And we want to talk about discipling relationships. How do we, maybe outside of church, come alongside younger folks and kind of walk this thing out with them? That's where we're going with this series. Again, my heart is the heart aspect of it. What does Scripture say about the truth of the gospel and who God has made us to be? And also then how do we reach out to people who are different? So very practical as well.